Right, so you've learned a little bit more about the Victorian society and their attitudes towards crime and punishment. What we need to look at is how that was reflected in Conan Doyle's stories and his writing. So we know that Arthur Conan Doyle was making a social commentary. He was exploring social prejudice and ideas. And so we need to look at what were the ideas and how did Conan Doyle respond to them. Obviously in the video it was mentioned there that the Industrial Revolution, which was a huge turning point in the Victorian period, a time where industry shifted society massively, it created opportunity, it created jobs, it created a huge new workforce, but it also widened the class divide. It created this huge new working class who, though they now had these new jobs, had a space in society which was almost dangerous and certainly threatened. They were given a broad generalisation by the middle and upper classes as a kind of animalistic group. They were considered to be the criminal class, and there was the association: if you were poor, if you were of the working class, you were also criminal. You were in some way barbaric. You were not able to control your behaviour in the same way, and there was often again the assumption that things like substance abuse, alcoholism, drug use would have been really rife in the working class. Now, all of these prejudices still exist today. There are still many societies, including sadly our own, where these class prejudices are a big part of our social economic ideas, and it is troubling. It is something that writers today are still concerned with. Now, what Conan Doyle does, arguably, is mock these ideas. He mocks the prejudiced generalisations that are made about class and the nature of criminality. We're going to explore how he does that in a moment. We understand, looking back at the Victorian period with a more critical eye, that many crimes that took place, this is a huge period of criminal activity, especially in cities like London, but so many of the thefts of the the attacks or whatever those crimes might have been, were a case of survival. So if it was the case that more working class individuals were committing crimes or certainly getting caught, it was often because of desperation, because of reduced circumstances. And actually, when we look back at how those people were tried and how they were punished, it's incredibly unfair and it appears incredibly cruel, because whether someone was trying to survive or not, that didn't matter to the criminal justice system or to the popular prejudices. So someone would have been blamed and chastised even if they were stealing an apple to feed their family, etc. Now, those ideas and aspects of the criminal, barbaric, animalistic working class were perpetuated by many stories of the times, and many writers, particularly in the Penny Dreadful stories, emphasised and exaggerated the nature of the working class as criminal. However, my interpretation is that Arthur Conan Doyle arguably does the opposite. Although he does in some of his stories, and if you read more of his stories you will see this, he does fall into cliches and caricatures of certain types of people. That's definitely something that he is guilty of. He also does a lot, and I think especially in this story, to expose the hypocrisy of class judgments and prejudice. For instance, he exposes the hypocrisy in the upper class gentleman, and spotlights the fact that actually those at the top end of the class system were behaving in a similarly criminal way. They just weren't being caught or they weren't being judged. He spotlights the reality, I think, of Victorian criminality a lot better and a lot more honestly, perhaps, than some of the other stories at the time. And he does intend, I believe, to highlight the inconsistencies in the Victorian paradox and the contradictory nature of the Victorian period. So, how does he do this? Well, he does this through his characters. And he does this particularly through the character of the King of Bohemia, and the other working class characters that he chooses to present in the story. Now, I've just highlighted a quotation from chapter 2 here, the beginning of chapter 2, and it depicts the first costume that we see Sherlock Holmes take on. We know Sherlock Holmes is a master of disguise, and Sherlock is clever in the disguises that he chooses. He deliberately chooses disguises that will allow him to interact with different members of society, will allow him to go unnoticed, will allow him to behave in a certain way. He, as a gentleman, is not interested in maintaining that gentleman status. He's more than willing to cast off that guise, to cast off that idea and take on someone else's status in society in order to solve the crime, in order to achieve justice, arguably. So in this first one, he comes in as an ill-kempt drunkard, a messy, dishevelled, animalistic version of the working class, and he's happy to take on that guise and to become disreputable. He doesn't see that as dishonourable. He doesn't see that as something which is going to taint him in any way. He wants to do that because he wants to discover the truth, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the other working class characters that he engages with in that disguise. Then we have the King of Bohemia, and I think he's particularly important when you're looking at how did Conan Doyle intend to present class, because I do not think that the King of Bohemia is a very positive representation of upper classes. When we first see him, he comes in with a somewhat bewildering disguise. He has the mask on. He's almost caricatured there. He's almost mocked and made to look foolish, particularly as Sherlock Holmes knows who he is already. So he sort of has to pull off the mask quite quickly because his identity is already revealed. So I think he's initially presented as kind of foolish and one step behind. And then importantly, he's the criminal in this as much as Irene, because he's gone through this scandalous act. He's engaged in a romantic, perhaps sexual relationship with Irene. He's trying to hide it in order to have this new marriage with the princess and to take on the appropriate relationship. But he has engaged in an illicit activity, so he is at fault as much as Irene, arguably, although she obviously goes to the next stage and blackmails. So I think that he's foolish and he's flawed. And then it's really interesting to see how Sherlock himself reacts to the King of Bohemia. So I've given you a couple of quotations at the bottom here. Now, at the end of the story, Sherlock doesn't seem to respect the king at all. He speaks to someone who is in every way, in the Victorian ideals, his better. And actually, he treats him quite disrespectfully. So we have here, the king says, "Would Irene have not made an admirable queen? It's a pity she's not on my level. She's not as good as I am. She isn't of my status." And the king says that without any kind of understanding that would be an inappropriate thing to say. He's like, well, that's just how it is. She's a lesser woman. She's an opera singer. I'm a king. We're of different levels. I'm higher than her. And Sherlock responds with sarcasm. He responds sardonically here. He says, "She is indeed on a very different level," said Holmes coldly. Some of you remarked on this in your essays so brilliantly, and I was really impressed that Holmes disagrees. Holmes believes that Irene is of a higher level. He disregards class. He disregards her circumstance as an opera singer or a scandalous woman, and he disregards the king's title, and he says, well, actually, she's higher than you because she has the intelligence. And that's one of the examples that shows us that perhaps Conan Doyle, through the character of Holmes, is disregarding class prejudice and disregarding this fascination with status above everything else. He also, we've got here, he turns away without observing the hand, so he doesn't shake the hand of the king, which would be, quite a huge deal to not shake the king's hand and just to turn away, as if he is dismissing that man of higher status. And then we also have the working class characters. So in chapter 2, a little bit earlier in the story, we're introduced to the ostlers, the group of people who are looking after the horses. We're also introduced to serving maids and the carvers, the scissors grinders, and lots of other working class characters who play minor roles within the story. But it's interesting, if you look closely at how they are presented, I lent the ostlers a hand in rubbing down their horses, and received in exchange twopence, a glass and a half, 2 fills of shag tobacco, and as much information as I could desire. I know they're gossiping. I know they're, they're not saints here, but listen to how they're described. I lent them a hand and I received in exchange. There's a sense of understanding. There's a sense of generosity. There's a sense of acceptance that Holmes experiences when he's talking to these ostlers. Arguably, he is much more respectful in his presentation of them, or his impression of them, than he is of the king. So for Sherlock Holmes, it's not degrading to have this conversation. He has the understanding of the usefulness and the expertise of these men, which again goes against these prejudices and indicates that Doyle is perhaps trying to spotlight inconsistencies in this paradox.